Content warning. Nazism, fascism, anti-Semitism, vivisection, serial killing, and hypnotic compulsion. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe? Games of chance are the oldest form, the strongest and most common form in which those who lack traditional artistic talent are able to feel like artists. 1921. A spectre is haunting Europe, but not the one Marx wrote about. In Germany, a sinister figure accrues acolytes and lays down the foundation for the new world he wishes to build, a world built on hatred and absolute obedience to his will. It is a man who claims to operate on scientific principles, but has a supernatural, nearly satanic aspect, a man who can bend others to his will by force of personality. He walks among the rich and powerful as one of them, appearing as a figure of respect and authority, but beneath it burns insecurity, anger, and unchecked ego, and even when he's destroyed, his words live on, possessing others, as though his spirit returns again and again to plague the world. He goes by many names, but his true name is Dr. Mabuse, neurologist, gambler, hypnotist, criminal, and would-be dictator of Sito-Pomar. First appearing in Norbert Jacques' novel Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, the character became even more famous when Fritz Lang adapted the book to the silver screen a year later, then a decade later to a sequel, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. An ominous figure with hypnotic powers that seem to border on the occult and a desire to rule with an iron fist, Mabuse seems to chillingly foreshadow the rise of the Nazi regime. Welcome to What Mad Universe, the podcast that traverses the history of pulp, sci-fi, and fantasy, and the origins of pop culture. I'm Adam Prosser. With me, as always, is Phil Rice.
Hello.
And we're joined once again by Jess Nevins, author of the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Victoriana. You may know him from his annotations on Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen comics. So again, we're talking today about Dr. Mabuse. Not again. We're talking about Dr. Mabuse, which was an interesting interbellum, I guess, character who is a a criminal genius, a mad scientist. Well, not a scientist, but I guess he's technically a scientist. Yeah. He's a neurologist. But he's one of the figures who inspired the 20th century supervillain in many ways. Phil, I don't know if either you or Jess know anything about Norbert Jacques, the guy who wrote this book, at all. Do we have anything?
A little bit. He's from Luxembourg. He wrote the Mabuse. He wrote, I think, 3 of the Mabuse books. He wrote for the films. He wrote some other stuff for the dime novels. I think that's the extent of my knowledge of him.
Yes, he doesn't seem to have been a particularly fascinating person, as far as I can tell. I was a little confused why he was a German writer, but he had a French name. But it sounds like it's because he was from Luxembourg, so right. That's where they speak both French and German. But I know that usually, Phil likes the movies and things that have been adapted from the stuff we talk about. But I sort of like to try to focus it more on the books. But in this case, you kind of can't separate the books and the movies, because it sounds like Norbert Jacques, like he was literally writing a sequel to Dr. Mabuse at one point, and he basically ended up just giving it to Fritz Lang and adapting it into the movie, right?
Right.
Yes. The sequel was going to be called Mabuse's Colony, or Mabuse's Colony. It was going to be, spoilers, Mabuse dies at the end of the novel. And it was going to be about his colony, Itopomar, which was founded on his principles. And there'd be a group of colonists who were working off of his last will and testament, his manifesto, to carry on his criminal will. And there was going to be a evil sort of female Dr. Mabuse type character named Frau Christina.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And so he sort of pitched this to Fritz Lang, and Fritz Lang said it wasn't very cinematic. Though I think it sounds like an interesting story. But also the first Dr. Mabuse movie didn't actually use the Itopomar concept, which is...
Sitopomar, I believe it's called.
In some translations.
Oh, okay. All right.
The idea is that Mabuse's ultimate goal is to found a republic or a dictatorship in the Brazilian rainforest.
Right, in Brazil, no less. Yeah. Let's rewind a bit here just to describe the book. It is, it's basically a manhunt for a big supervillain of the kind that there were apparently quite a few in fiction, from what I can tell. Of course, there was Dr. Moriarty, Fu Manchu, there was Fantomas in France, and Svengali, who seems to have been a big inspiration for Mabuse in the first place. Is that Jess? Would you say that Dr. Moriarty, is he sort of the beginning of that archetype, or are there earlier ones than that?
I'm leaning back and cracking my knuckles here on this one. Well, 19th century, you start with the Gothic supervillains, and then they sort of transform through the 40s and 50s into these run-of-the-mill criminals, and then in the 60s and 70s, you get the Penny Dreadfuls and the dime novels and British story papers. And that's where the idea of the extraordinary villain, who is in some ways the counterpart to the extraordinary hero, begins to develop. Moriarty was certainly the most influential of the supervillains of the time, but in terms of who was famous when, you've also got Dr. Nicola, who is a hypnotic master criminal with world domination goals. And then you've got, from the American Nick Carter dime novels, you've got Dr. Quartz, who's a evil surgeon who likes to vivisect women and who's basically Hannibal Lecter 100 years early.
Oh, really? Dr. Quartz, did you say? Okay.
Dr. Quartz, just like the Rock. Unfortunately, none of the Quartz stories are reprinted, so you really have to go searching to find them. But he first shows up in a railway car that's full of butterflies pinned to the wall, which is a nice touch. Anyway, Moriarty begins it, but there are, like I said, Dr. Nicola also popularized the figure of the supervillain. You get into the 1900s and 1910s, and the dime novel industry becomes this giant profitable thing in Europe. And so you've got all these different dime novels with fantastic heroes in them, and in some of them you've got their evil counterparts. And I'd say Mabuse is coming out of that tradition. He's just a lot more stylishly done because of Fritz Lang's touch.
Right. Well, and it is interesting to me from what I've seen of these characters, Fu Manchu, Fantomas, and Mabuse to a certain extent. Of course, they're the villains, but they all seem to really overshadow the hero who's there to take them down. Like, nobody remembers Nayland Smith. Everyone remembers Fu Manchu, right?
Or Detective Shu from Fantomas stories.
Right. They have their arch nemesis, but he's almost there to just be the bland protagonist. And I mean, maybe they're brilliant or whatever, but it's the villain who really looms and gets the name on the title, right? So that's actually kind of interesting to me that the villain took over seemingly at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, I'd say that one's also Victorian, because you go back to the beginning of the series Heroes in like the 1850s and 1860s, and authors have so much trouble making the heroes distinctive beyond being brilliant and being good fighters, and that's sort of it. So at the turn of the century, the two main characters in American and British popular literature are Sexton Blake and Nick Carter. And both of those are kind of two-dimensional and colorless, but their rogues galleries are fantastic and completely overshadow them. And it's just this tendency, it's sort of the Superman problem, where unless you're really good as a writer, your Superman is going to be comparatively bland relative to Lex Luthor or Bizarro or whoever.
Interesting. Yeah, because when did Sexton Blake get started?
1886.
Right, but he does post-date Sherlock Holmes, right?
Oh no, it's Nick Carter who predates Sherlock Holmes. Blake postdates Holmes.
Right. So, yeah, that was what I meant. Yeah, he comes after Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, but it was because I've heard a lot of people basically say, oh, what is it with Professor Moriarty? He's in one story. I mean, technically, he's sort of off screen, but mentioned a lot in the Valley of Fear too, I believe. But he's basically in one story. Why does everyone think Moriarty's this super important character? But I mean, he's clearly cast a huge shot. Like, he's clearly captured people's imaginations just from being in this one story. I mean, maybe I'm way, but like that was what I said. I didn't know if maybe I was ascribing too much to Moriarty and maybe there was another antecedent. But you seem to be confirming what I thought, which was that Moriarty is the.
Yeah, I'd agree that Moriarty casts a long shadow over other villains, to the point where if you've got a Holmesian detective, or even just are doing crime fiction and you're doing a supervillain, your starting point is going to be Moriarty, unless you've got a particularly strong imagination and you're willing to add other elements into the mix. Mabuse is one of the things that fascinates me about Mabuse is that he starts out as kind of an anti-hero defying Weimar Germany. And so you can almost read something heroic into it, but then he just goes completely evil. So there was like the germ of something not noble, but really fascinating to him as an anti-hero that he almost loses when he just becomes a thoroughgoing villain.
Right. Yeah, he's an ideologue at first, as Phil was Phil described it as, you initially said it was a socialist utopia that he wanted to build.
I was under the impression before I read the novel that that's what it was, but
no, it's
dictatorship.
Just, he just wants to rule and be in charge of everyone, as far as I can tell. And it's almost, in the novel, it's almost like when he's a shadowy off-screen figure, it's one thing, but then when you meet him, he's kind of petty as a person.
Yeah, he gets drunk, he has anger issues, he yells at his underlings.
Yeah, he treats them, he's the classic, guy who abuses his subordinates because he's the supervillain kind of character. So it almost diminishes him when you actually meet him and get in his head in the story, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, Jock and Lang are sort of in this no-win situation where they build him up so much that you're inevitably going to be disappointed when you meet him. But he's definitely weak and petty. I can't help but wonder how much of that was imposed by like the Jock's editor or the studio heads. for the people over Fritz Lang. You know, you never, certainly at that time, there wasn't auteur theory going on in cinema, and writers had a lot less independence than they do now. So they were a lot more vulnerable to editors saying, no, we can't make him a hero, change him. And we'll never know we'll never know the case, whether Jacques was influenced by his editor or not.
Well, I was. That reminds me of how supposedly in H.G. Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau, he had apparently intended Moreau to be a hero originally, as a basically eugenicist, and people said, his editor or someone pointed out that was kind of creepy, and he flipped it around so that Moreau was more of a villain, but that he had been intended as a heroic character, from what I understand.
I think that was an early intention on Wells' part. I'd heard that anecdote. I don't know whether it's true or not.
Yeah, because again, this is one of I like my unsourced anecdotes apparently, but yeah, it's definitely very interesting. It sounds like another. I think Jacques actually explicitly mentioned this as an influence was Svengali.
Yes, that's from Trilby.
Right.
Which I've read.
Right. Trilby.
Yeah, I didn't like it, but it's not my thing.
Right.
Like it wasn't badly written. It just wasn't for me.
Well, Trilby, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't read it, but he's more. He's not less of a crime lord. He's more. He's sinister, but he kind of latches on. Go on. Sorry.
Svengali's a music teacher who wants to become world famous, and he hypnotizes Trilby and basically makes her into a robot,
right,
who sings at his command. There's no crime lord in him. He's just as weak as Mabuse turns out to be, though. He's really sleazy and there's Trilby's interesting as a novel while not being very good. There's a lot going on in there, but it's all overshadowed by the anti-Semitism of the novel and and just the whole hypnotizing a woman so that you can exploit her in every way imaginable thing going on. So
the anti-Semitism was really gross. There's a point where Svengali mocks another character for bathing.
Yeah, although I read a review. I think it was actually of the movie, but he pointed out that there's actually something to, and this might have been, I think it was Lionel Barrymore who played him, but he just said that. He actually sort of portrayed him as a guy who deliberately makes himself really unappealing and gross and almost pathetic so that you underestimate him, and then he kind of sneaks in and
I didn't
gets
get
you.
that feeling from the book.
Yeah, the book. That might just be trying to dress up the book and make it a little less gross, basically.
Yeah, that's not in the book.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. That's interesting too, though. That almost seems like a bridge now because, as I say, Mabuse, they both have hypnotic powers, basically, which are almost pseudo mystical in terms of how they're able to control people, even like literally at a distance, like almost telepathically at one point. I mean, Mabuse is anyway. I don't know if Svengali ever gets to that level. But it seems like a bit of a bridge between a 19th century kind of villain you see, who's this sort of parasite villain who tries to latch on to, especially a woman, and because we're again with Vampire City. Count Goetze was he's actually he does that as well. He insinuates himself into a rich couple and he kind of bleeds them dry because he's a vampire. Ha ha ha. But that seems to have been a type of villain that you saw in the 19th century. Am I completely wrong about that? Or
no, that one goes back to the Gothics. That was definitely a recurring character type among 19th century villains. And in that respect, yeah, you're right. Mabuse, Svengali's a sort of bridge between 19th century and the 20th century villains to come. The impression in the first half of Mabuse is so strong there's, if I'm remembering, there's a shot of his eyes over the Berlin cityscape, or maybe of his face looming over the city.
Yeah, his eyes are very much, I mean, to the point where the third sequel is literally called The Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse, and he really emphasizes his eyes and everything. And in the sequel, when he's a spirit, he literally has this giant paper mache head with giant eyes bulging out of it to suggest that kind of thing. So, and of course, Rudolf Kleineroj, I believe is the pronunciation, the guy who played him, has these really hypnotic eyes himself, right? He's got these very memorable eyebrows and, commanding eyes. So that's, and it seems like they had an idea of what hypnotism was in the early 20th century, where it's kind of like how radiation became in the mid 60s, where it was just, it magically did everything basically.
Yeah.
And sort of, yeah.
Yeah. The whole mesmerism craze, you had people not just being hypnotized, but talking about the mesmeric fluids and psychic mesmerism. And like you say, it was like radiation in the 60s, where you'd wonder how radiation worked, and people would say science. Well, Victorians, you'd say mesmerism.
Now it's quantum.
Yeah, exactly.
Or quantum, right.
Yeah, I remember. If I'm not mistaken, some of the sort of early Golden Age magician characters, like Mandrake the magician, maybe not him specifically, but there were some Mandrake knockoffs, and it was, all their powers are hypnotic in nature. But he can literally go ahead.
No, that's what Mandrake started out as having magic powers, but then Lee Falk decided to make them all hypnotism. So he waves his hand and everyone instantly becomes hypnotized. And so it seems
right.
like he's throwing snakes at them, but it's hypnosis.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, just the easy catch-all for everything you want to do. But it's that whole idea. And in the book of Dr. Mabuse, he can. It's implied that strong-willed people can fight him off, but he can basically make anyone do anything. The book, by the way, is called Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, so is the first film. Sorry, the book is called Dr. Mabuse. The film is called Dr. Mabuse the Gambler.
No, they're both called The Gambler.
Right.
Though it's a German word that might... it means gambler literally, but it has other connotations.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, it might be like the player. It implies playing people, or
like a puppet master.
Yeah, puppet master sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Of course. I was wondering if there was some extra level to that, basically, because it seems
it's a translation issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting that your supervillain is a gambler. As we were pointing out, we did a show on the James Bond books a few weeks back, and a lot of the James Bond villains are gamblers as well, and they're usually cheats as well, just like Dr. Mabuse is. And
Le Chiffre in particular seems very Mabuse-like.
Yeah,
I know Fleming claimed he was based on Aleister Crowley, but I don't see that at all.
Well, but even linking him to Crowley would kind of make it sound like, he was a mysterious, mystical figure, kind of thing. So maybe that's why he said Aleister Crowley. Okay. He didn't want to get sued by Norbert Jacques, basically. He wanted to make the connection and not make it obvious. But yeah, just this idea of, a villain would cheat at cards, basically. That's kind of an interesting idea. But yeah, that is, and of course, yeah, as you say, it sort of portrays the idea of a guy who's got all these little. The gambling is a metaphor for how he plays with people's lives, kind of thing, which is really interesting. So then, of course, in the decade after the book was published, the Nazis rose to power in Germany. The novel, Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, seems to foreshadow Hitler and the rise of fascism in a number of significant ways. He's sort of a cultural shadow of Hitler, from the mesmerizing hold on people to the desire to build an empire where his word is law. It is actually really almost creepy in some ways. And I mean, I obviously the Nazis existed, but whether they were specifically something people were looking at and going, oh, that's going to be a big deal. It is kind of ominous how much of the Nazis were foreshadowed in Mabuse. He wants to dominate people. He can dominate people mysteriously. He takes control over people's people's minds, and yeah, he's a puppet master behind the scenes. He wants to literally build an empire. He wants to be completely obeyed. And then literally even in South America, that's the part that really freaks me out. He's got it all. Everything is planned out in advance there. It's sort of creepy. I mean, do you think Jacques was maybe referencing that? Did he see anything? Was he foresighted in some way?
I'd love to read a biography of Jacques just to see what his thinking was behind Mabuse. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if Lang was thinking about fascism when he made the movies Jacques. I don't know about.
Right.
It's really interesting looking at the popular fiction of Weimar Germany, especially like detective fiction, adventure fiction, science fiction. You've got all these really fantastic heroes, and fascism is the one type of criminal they never fight. You fight communists in all these different detective series and science fiction series and whatnot, but they never seem to touch fascism. And it makes me wonder, and we're talking, 1919, 1920, 1921, just what sort of influence the fascists had on German society that early, because we are talking before Hitler.
No, yeah, that's just, as I'm saying, I mean, it might have been hard in 1921 to be able to point to Hitler and say, well, he's a big deal. I mean, he was around, he was making noise, but if I've got my history right, he was still kind of on the fringes at that point. It wasn't kind of till the late 20s where he started to really make noise.
Yeah, it was 25, 26, I think.
Right. But at the same time, it might have been possible for someone to sort of say, hey, there's something in the air. And you mentioned, of course, Fritz Lang, he of course, he may have noticed it the first movie. The second movie, of course, came out literally under the Nazi regime and was banned. And he fled when it was banned. Right. And it was explicitly like anti-Nazi movie, the second movie, because he literally put Nazi slogans into the mouths of criminals in that movie, and the story goes, I've heard people contest this, but the story is that basically he got to Goebbels called Fritz Lang into his office or something and said, well, we're banning your movie because it's not appropriate for the new regime, but we'd like you to become a major film director or something. And Fritz Lang basically said, okay, great idea, and then he got the hell out of the country, basically.
I think I've heard that one.
Yeah. It was also said that he liked to exaggerate, Fritz Lang, so he might have been a little bit putting it a little bit over the top, but certainly, because of course he was Jewish, if I'm not mistaken, he was like part Jewish, yeah. And his wife may have also been Jewish. I'm not 100% sure.
No, I think, wasn't she a Nazi? Didn't he
they
divorce
got
her because she had
divorced before he fled? Yeah, his wife Thea von Harbu worked for the Nazis for a while.
Wow. Okay, I did not know that. Yeah, that's an interesting. How does a Jewish guy marry a Nazi? That's interesting. Although, of course, it's before everything, but still, yikes. But yeah, he was pretty explicitly being anti-Nazi with the second.
Yeah,
one.
Though there is some thought on that, and there's a book called "From Caligari to Hitler: A Psychological History of German Film," from written in 1947 by Siegfried Krakauer. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a Marxist. He was associated with the Frankfurt School, the much maligned Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, conspiracy theories, and whatnot. But he was talking about how film, as a collaborative medium shaped by market demands, was uniquely suited to reveal the subconscious mind of the masses. So the escapist films, in particular Weimar Germany, he said helped pave the way for the Nazi regime. Not intentionally, but through certain themes. Say Count Orlok from Nosferatu is in some ways a Jewish stereotype with the big nose aristocrat, and like once again, these probably weren't even intentionally put in there, but it's sort of shaped ideas. And Mabuse was one of them. He's a shadowy puppet master, greedy, chaotic force of criminality, and of course, Lang was anti-Nazi, of course.
Right.
But Krakauer states that the intentions of the films were relevant, that regardless of what they meant to convey, they helped shape the public's demand for supreme authority, and that the Nazis used that in their rise to power.
Well, I mean,
this is obviously, a lot of this is contested, but but it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those, the issues with, once you're determined to be anti-Semitic and see, Semitic conspiracies everywhere, you can start to identify literally everything as, that's inspiring. As we've seen literally in our modern day right now, there are people who they'll take something that's obviously wrong and go, well, that's a Jewish conspiracy, and it's like, well, that thing is obviously a bad thing, but you're immediately, turning it into an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And as you say, he was, he fits to me much more with the rise of the Nazis, but you're right, he does also fit in with the stereotype of, these evil Jewish puppet masters who are trying to control everything, basically, and who are criminals. And as you say, the hero is a policeman who's working.
He's he's a state attorney.
State attorney, sorry, that's
but
right.
But he's practically a policeman.
Yeah, he's basically a cop, trying to stop Mabuse. He's the hero, and he's portrayed very romantically and dashingly. He's in love with the woman. It's interesting, Jess, that what you said about, he's you could see Mabuse as a hero because he's defying Weimar Germany, because it's true. There's a certain decadence going on in the society that's portrayed in the book. So I've read the book more recently than I've seen the movie, so I'm sort of drawing on the book more. But it's true that they portray it as, a haven of sin and rich upper class twits, and and even the love interest is already married when he meets Venk. But yeah, is that what you're thinking of when you say he was kind of defeating the Weimar Germany?
Yeah. The Krakauer book I actually read in grad school. It was interesting, but what I've learned since then is that you could sort of say the same thing about fiction, German genre fiction in the 20s, which was very popular and had high circulation numbers. I would love it if someone would do an English language analysis of them the way Krakauer did for film, because I think you could pretty much say the same thing about laying the groundwork for the Nazis. I don't think it was solely film. I think it was in print. Sorry.
Oh yeah, the Frankfurt School seemed very snobbish from what I can tell.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think is really, really difficult to pin down, because you can retroactively go and say things, but it really is spooky. Like I say, I mean, even the fact that he wants to take off to South America, it gets spooky in retrospect when you look at it.
So let's talk about some of the movies.
Okay.
Because I watched most of them now.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's, of course, the famous Fritz Lang movies, the first three.
Right. Just to clarify, the first two are pre-World War II. The third one is made much later. It's 1960.
In 1960, yeah.
Right, that's The Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse.
And then there was a series of films made in the 60s that I thought were pretty fun, actually. Not great cinema, but they were entertaining for the most part. The last one was a total rip-off of Thunderball, the book. Like, it had the same... it was about a death ray instead of not Spectre, but it had a death ray instead of a nuclear missile that was holding the world hostage, right. And it had a whole thing with underwater divers fighting, and I don't know, it just seemed very similar.
Oh, okay.
And it had the main character was a British spy who spoke German for no reason, but
well, he's a spy. He has to be international. Okay, and then they made a 90s movie, I believe?
There was a film made in 1990 that was loosely based on the first movie. Mm-hmm. It's called Dr. M, also called Club Extinction. I watched that today, actually. It's an interesting sort of, I don't know, it reminded me of Videodrome. It was very much about media saturation, and it was supposedly set in the future, but the Berlin Wall was still up. And they use that as a metaphor, as like the city was walled off, and so people were constantly yearning for escape, and that became a metaphor for yearning from escape from life. And the plot was that he was using sort of hypnotism through televisions to cause people to commit suicide, because he himself was suicidal. It wasn't actually Dr. Mabuse; it was just
Dr. M.
Yeah,
we should
a name starting with M.
We should point out that, as you said, Dr. Mabuse basically dies early on in the second movie, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. And it is literally called The Testament of Dr. Mabuse because he leaves a will, which is almost... he's almost the king in yellow, because he leaves behind his words, which if people read them, they basically go insane and become the new Mabuse, and is strongly implied or even explicitly stated to be possessed by the spirit of Dr. Mabuse, who jumps from body to body, basically.
Yeah, there was a 60s remake of The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, which explicitly said that. Like, they made it very clear that Mabuse was controlling the psychiatrist's mind.
Right.
So after the 90s version, there was also a 70s version I wasn't able to track down, but there was two movies made in 2013 and 2014 that were just awful.
Yes. So I don't think we need to. I keep telling Phil, you don't have to watch those, Phil. They can't possibly be relevant to what we're doing.
It was kind of interesting, though. It was really badly done, like completely amateur effects. It was sort of Sin City on a budget. Just all shot on green screen, and that, digital artifacts all over the place because they didn't do it very well.
Oh, God.
Weird acting.
Yeah.
But it was the only of these movies that actually used the Itopomar concept.
Oh, okay.
With Dr. Mabuse wanting to turn the city into his own utopia.
Oh, okay.
And it also had Frau Christina in it, sort of.
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting. It shows that the character has lingered for so long in the popular imagination, at least in Germany, that they're still, trying to make movies.
These were in English, so I don't know.
But they could be. But they looked like German movies to me, but they were made in English, maybe for the international market.
I don't know.
They do speak English. A lot of people.
Yeah, I got it for $5 on Amazon, and the DVD barely played. It was a mess.
But yeah, I just did want to go back to, because it seems like there was a bit of a run, not just leading up to him, we talked about it, but afterwards there was a bit of a boom, especially in Europe, of these anti-hero supervillains who were kind of the stars of the show. They made Fantomas movies in the 60s as well.
They were comedies, I believe.
Yeah, well, I guess everything was campy in the 60s was kind of the idea. But I mean, Danger Diabolique is another example of that. I go completely insane and say that Walter White feels like, in some ways, an echo of Dr. Mabuse. That's probably not intentional, but he feels like a similar guy in some way. Am I completely insane for saying that? Or
I tend to associate Mabuse with the hypnotism and telepathy and all that aspect. I'm not sure I'd say Walter White is Mabuse-like.
It's a bit off the wall, but it is true though, because Mabuse combines the Moriarty thing of, like, he's the hypnotism, but also the Moriarty thing of just he's this brilliant master criminal who has plans upon plans and wheels upon wheels. And you can almost take the hypnotism out of him. He would be a different character, but you could take it out and he'd still be a pretty formidable opponent, right? Like he's got He's got all these, he's got all these wheel spin. He talks about at one point, he's like, I might have to change my plans and pack up and move to another country where they don't speak German, and it'll take me another year to earn enough. Like he's even with that huge a setback, he's like, yeah, but I'll still be able to do it in a year, basically. Like,
yeah, the '60s movies, he didn't have, he didn't use hypnotism as much. It was still there. But say one of them, he uses drugs to control people's minds.
Yeah,
Another one, there's a camera-like device that controls minds.
Right. In the Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse, he's
not even in it.
Well, yeah, but again, his spirit lives on.
Yeah.
That's his shtick at this point. Is that but it's literally a hotel where he's surveilling everyone. So it's. Those are the Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse. But he doesn't control anyone hypnotically in that one. Oh yeah, he does. I'm sorry. He's a psychologist who has a woman under his control because she's his patient, and he almost gets her to commit suicide, but she doesn't. But they've toned down the hypnotism part a lot for the Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse. Wouldn't you say?
Unfortunately, that's one I haven't seen, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like that one they kind of went, okay, the hypnotism thing was a bit silly. Like they almost tried to walk it back a little bit. With the
it goes back and forth.
Yeah, and he also does explicitly mention actually surprisingly little mention of the Nazis. Given that it was the '60s, he could say whatever he wanted about the Nazis. But they did
call them thugs and criminals and stuff.
Oh yeah, he insults them and he talks about how oh, thank God we got away. He basically says Dr. Mabuse got away in the horror of the Nazi regime, kind of linking them to them there as well, I think, but more subtly than I would have thought. I mean, I would have expected him to go nuts if he felt like it, but he doesn't. Anyway, Jess, do you have any further thoughts on Dr. Mabuse we haven't mentioned?
Well, it's interesting reading the. I keep going back to the German dime novel industry just because it's something I've done a lot of research on. But it's interesting how you had supervillains and you occasionally had a hypnotist, but nobody tried to rip off Mabuse in a way that people tried to rip off Moriarty. It was almost like Mabuse was too potent. You know, they didn't want to get too close to him just because they'd be compared.
Well, that hasn't stopped a lot of people from doing ripoffs in the past, but yeah, I see what I know what you're saying. It would be too easily identifiable as Mabuse. Because he's that's actually, you're talking about the German dime novels and stuff. They really seem to have had a real thriving pulp industry to rival America. Maybe I'm extrapolating, but it seems like they were like it's American and German were both really up there.
Right. It was until 36 and 37 when the Nazis finally put an end to it. The German pulp industry dime novel industry was the equivalent of the American pulp industry, and you had this really colorful variety of heroes and villains. But the Nazis, they had the writers and editors had to walk a line between appealing to the audience and also not crossing the Nazis too much. And I could rattle off hero names, but it wouldn't mean anything to anyone.
I recall one named Sun Ko, who was described as the sort of fascist Doc Savage.
Yes, the German Doc Savage. He's got the map of Atlantis tattooed on his back, and at the end of the Sun Ko novels has Atlantis rising from the sea and the countries of the earth being flooded and all the Untermenschen being wiped out, and it was all very fascist. Very fascist. Yeah.
So somebody decided Doc Savage wasn't eugenicist enough.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, but what is it? I mean, again, I know people like pulps and people like dime novels. I guess the French had their own cottage industry, but yeah, what is it about Germany? I guess is it that Weimar decadence we've heard so much about again, or is it Weimar decadence, or is it something else that just?
I think there's this struggle in German popular culture in the 20s and early 30s between wanting to do sort of pre-war, relatively normal, relatively German popular culture, and then you've got a reaction. On the other hand, you've got this more politicized stuff, which is a reaction to Weimar and a reaction to the communists in the streets, and to a much lesser extent, a reaction to the fascists in the streets. And there's this sort of struggle between doing ordinary non-politicized stuff and doing very politicized stuff. And eventually the politicized stuff wins out. And then the Nazis seize power. And during World War I, the German dime novel publishers had said to the wartime censors, "Oh, we're going along with your rules. You don't need to read our dime novels." And the censors actually took them at their word, and so the German dime novel publishers got away with publishing pretty much whatever they wanted during most of World War I until the paper shortages hit. But the Nazis weren't going to be tricked that way.
That's interesting. Huh. Yeah, it's, and I mean, we were talking about film in general. We were talking about the whole idea of, this paved the way for the Nazis. I mean, it's certainly true that they used film and their own version. They tried to make their own pop culture. It thankfully hasn't really lasted too much. It didn't really catch on. We still have a few of the movies they made and stuff, but that they seem to understand that pulpy pop culture thing in a sense. I mean, they didn't, I wouldn't say they were good at it necessarily, but I think they were speaking to some of the same urges maybe that people liked in pop culture, and that is just interesting, which is again why people can say, oh, Dr. Mabuse, he was presumably the Nazis never said, oh yeah, Dr. Mabuse, that's what we're fighting, those anti, the Jewish conspiracy. But they can, as you say, that you could draw that as a parallel of the kind of fear and anxiety that was out there that they drew on. And that's always been the problem with pulp. It's got that kind of reactionary streak. There's good, there's pulp that tries to be positive, I think, but there's always been a certain reactionary streak to it, I think, that pushes, that goes for the cheap. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, it goes for the cheap the cheap thrill and the lurid, and the creep out, basically. And that's the same thing that, not to be oversimplistic about it, but anyway, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. This is, with our show about Dr. Mabuse, who is a great guy, and we must all do his bidding. He is our master. Mabuse, Sita Pomar. It will be great. So I'd like to once again thank the Mad Master of the World, Jess Nevins. Our producer, Alex. Yeah, well, it's just been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Jess.
Thank you so much.
Our producer, Alex Ross, who beams the show from his secret lair in the jungles of South America. And Jack Furyk, who corrupts the youth to his cause with music. I would like to mention, by the way, that I have a comic book dropping Strange Romance, a special edition of Strange Romance, which is the anthology comic that I edit, should be available as you listen to this on Comixology. Check that out. It's a really good
I drew a story
anthology.
in it.
Phil drew a story in it. And Phil, you had something you wanted to plug as well, right? Well, he's got...
I have a bunch of things.
He does the Apex Society and Undeath, which are both comics, and
it's actually one comic. Undeath's just a story in the Apex Society.
Right. That's the spin-off. Yes, exactly. And Jess, you've got Hey, are you able to tell us when the Encyclopedia Fantastic Victoriana edition 2 might be coming out? Or is that...
I'm shooting for June.
Oh, this June. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, if you haven't, Jess has written a very comprehensive encyclopedia about Fantastic Victoriana. There's going to be a second edition coming this June, so check that out for sure. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, Jess?
I actually wrote and self-published via Amazon a history of 20th century horror fiction written outside the United States and the United Kingdom. It's called Horror Needs No Passport, and I think it's pretty good. And if you're at all interested in horror fiction, it is definitely worth looking into.
Oh, okay, neat. That's on Amazon, you said?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll look for that as well. Okay, so we're Adam Prosser and Phil Rice, and if you kill us, we will live on like malevolent spirits to possess more bodies and begin our evil schemes anew. So sleep tight, everyone.